Nothing says fun and creativity in gaming like one massive greedy company engulfing another massive greedy company. If you've been paying attention to the news this week, then you would have heard that Netflix has just taken ownership of an absolutely enormous chunk of modern gaming history, and bizarrely, barely anyone in the mainstream entertainment press seems to be fully acknowledging what that actually means for video games from now on. Most of the coverage treated this acquisition like it was just another ho-hum corporate shuffle in Hollywood, a bit of streaming platform gossip, or the usual media conglomerate musical chairs. The kind of headline Bloomberg throws out while half of the industry scrolls past on their lunch break without really absorbing the gravity of what's really happening. But if you bother to look beyond variety headlines, amateur investment blogs, and tedious content synergy chatter, then Netflix has effectively positioned itself as the new parent of Mortal Kombat, Batman, Hogwarts Legacy, Traveller's Tales, and the entire Nemesis system, and a frighteningly large slice of Western AAA gaming. Despite knowing as much about gaming as a brick, yet here we are. I mean, they did just say that Warner Brothers gaming is essentially worthless. And we are genuinely supposed to believe this is fine? Of course it bloody isn't. We're talking about a company that can barely keep its own original programming alive past season 3, now holding the future of franchises that shaped entire gaming generations. Yet the response from most of the press seems to be a bored shrug and a quick rundown of which shareholder benefits are expected during fiscal quarter 4. Only in this industry could that level of insanity be spun as something reassuring, and only in this era could cultural control be handed over so casually without anyone stepping in to scream. So with that said, let's tear this terrible news to shreds. I am Lady Decade, and if you're tired of corporate mergers being sold as progress, then hit subscribe, because this is why Netflix buying Warner Brothers might be the most alarming development gaming has seen in years. The modern world is certainly vastly different to the one I remember growing up in, but despite the big tech lizards taking more and more control over the hobby we love, if you look hard enough, there are still great games and great deals to be had. Netflix may seem determined to drag us all down a subscription-shaped rabbit hole, but remember, you can still buy individual games, at least for now. We're talking 30% off the critically acclaimed Ark Raiders, 52% off Expedition 33, and brace yourself, 97% off of one of my all-time favourites, A Shadow of Mordor, bringing it down to less than $2. In fact, by clicking below, you can always save up to 90% off of thousands of games. So use my links, support the channel, and most importantly, keep hold of the games you can actually play whenever you like, rather than waiting for some streaming service to grant you permission. To any avid gamer with half a brain cell to rub together, the recent Netflix-Warner Brothers merger will have alarm bells ringing in your head. Yet the lame stream press are framing this whole thing as a triumphant story about streaming libraries merging and prestige television lining up against the Marvel industrial complex, as if this were merely Netflix trying to build the world's most depressing comic book streaming bundle. That's all they care about. Most newspapers and TV channels treat the world like gaming doesn't even exist, despite it being one of the biggest and most popular forms of entertainment on Earth. They seem to be actively and willingly choosing not to understand games on a cultural level, nor do they believe games deserve to be treated with the same seriousness as film. To them, games are basically an extra tab on a smart TV, something children fiddle with between episodes of Stranger Things, not a medium carrying decades of history, nostalgia, and global cultural impact. In their minds, it's still 1983. They view what we play as an awkward hobby that you grow out of, not the industry quietly out-earning every box office record they pretend to care about, all while proudly bragging about not understanding it like that's some sort of cultural achievement. Games certainly are not heritage to these people, and they're definitely not art. It's just a form of lowbrow content, that revolting little corporate buzzword that should frankly be considered a war crime when applied to gaming culture. So, of course, when Netflix buys Warner Brothers Discovery, the mainstream entertainment press focuses on HBO's future and whatever the hell is happening in the DC film universe this month, rather than stopping to ask what it means when one of the most culturally influential companies on the planet suddenly becomes a gatekeeper for a huge chunk of Western AAA gaming. The fact that gaming has now quietly fallen into the hands of Silicon Valley subscription giants should be setting off alarms across the entire industry, but apparently nobody has the time or energy to be outraged. Before we get wound up any further, let's slow this thing down and actually look at what Netflix now controls, because the scale is slightly insane when you line it all up. Warner Brothers games includes NetherRealm, the studio behind Mortal Kombat, a franchise literally founded on the idea of pushing boundaries, shocking parents, and getting banned by the American Senate in the 1990s. Mortal Kombat practically invented the concept of video game controversy, yet in recent years it has slowly mutated into a strangely apologetic hybrid of itself, unsure whether it wants to continue being the cheeky, brutal icon it once was, or reshape itself into a safe, classroom-approved, everyone gets a participation fatality program that modern cultural committees would give a gold star to. As sanitized as the franchise has become, already leaving it a shell of its former self, now Netflix gets to decide how to sanitize it even more going forward. That's basically like handing a chainsaw to someone whose favourite pastime is sanding everything down until it resembles a flat-pack IKEA piece of furniture. The whole point of Mortal Kombat was that it didn't apologise. Netflix, however, apologises for everything by default. Then you have Rocksteady, a studio that once gave us Arkham Asylum and Arkham City, games that didn't just entertain players but reshaped superhero gaming entirely, establishing an entire design language that other studios still copy today. For a long time, Rocksteady were gaming royalty, the gold standard of licensed adaptation, the one studio that made everyone else look lazy. Then Warner Brothers shoved them into Suicide Squad, a game so aggressively out of touch that it practically served as a live demonstration of everything wrong with late-stage games as a service design. And now, instead of being rescued, they're being handed over to Netflix, the company that has turned the art of questionable adaptations into a cottage industry so prolific that it could probably be listed separately on the stock exchange. If Netflix starts treating Batman the way they treat everything else, as a monthly user retention funnel rather than a creative universe, I guarantee the next Batman game will look less like Arkham City and more like one of those Fortnite battle passes where you buy a new cape every week. But wait, there's more. Avalanche is arguably the one that worries me the most, because Hogwarts Legacy wasn't just good, it was annoyingly good. It was unapologetically magical, full of joy, mechanically solid, dripping with atmosphere, and firmly focused on delivering a satisfying fantasy playground rather than a lecture about morality. And of course, it got dragged into a cultural anyway because, God forbid, a video game simply exists without a miniature COD war breaking out on Twitter. If Warner Brothers already panicked every time somebody merely whispered words J.K. Rowling, imagine the frantic spreadsheet crisis meetings Netflix will have. They'll probably have a mandatory pronoun selection screen for your owl, censor magical creatures for ideological safety, and publish a 12-page diversity committee statement every time a spell animation gets patched. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if they introduced Hogwarts house energy efficiency ratings and carpet footprint reporting every time you cast Lumos. Good grief, these companies are lame. Oh, and then there's Traveller's Tales, who used to be one of the most consistent and strangely wholesome studios in modern gaming. Their LEGO titles were genuinely delightful, silly in the best possible way, and quietly filled with more charm than most AAA blockbusters produced with 10 times the budget. They were proper comfort games, the kind of thing that you could enjoy with your children or even on your own, as the antidote to the relentless misery of modern live service design. LEGO games didn't ask you to analyse political messaging or or worry about corporate messaging. They just let you smash little plastic bricks and giggle at sight gags involving Darth Vader accidentally turning on the Hoover. But under Netflix, I fully expect every Lego title would become a corporate vehicle for messaging or a kids-safe streaming series tie-in, because that's how Netflix sees the world. It doesn't see games as artistic works at all. It sees them as intellectual properties waiting to be plugged into a conveyor belt of episodic content. It's capitalism disguised as creativity, and the disguise isn't even trying anymore. The mask fell off around 2019 and nobody ever bothered to pick it back up again. And then there's Monolith, and this one upsets me a little bit because it's a studio whose Nemesis system was so clever, so genuinely revolutionary that Warner Bros. Actually patented it, effectively preventing the rest of the industry from building upon its ideas. That system could have evolved into the next great pillar of interactive storytelling, a procedural renaissance of emergent rivalries and dynamic enemies that made every playthrough feel unique. But instead, it was locked away like a dangerous toy, never allowed to influence the wider industry, and eventually treated as a footnote. Imagine if physics engines or open world design had been patented and then buried away in the same way. Gaming history would look completely different. And the irony is that under Netflix, it will probably stay buried forever. Netflix has no incentive at all to encourage innovation unless it comes packaged with 10 different subscription options and an algorithm-approved engagement cycle. And the most depressing thing is that Monolith could have led an entire generation of designers into new territory, but instead, we'll probably get another Batman tie-in with emotional support villains and 15 different subscription tiers designed to gently squeeze money out of your nostalgia. And there may have been so many utterly joyless, bleak turns of events in gaming recently. So if you're sick of all the horrendous news, don't worry, I have some respite for you. If you want, you can check out my other channel, Lady Arcade, where each week we look at another odd, often experimental console from gaming's rich past. This week, I discussed the Nintendo Advanced Video System, a precursor to the NES that never saw release. So subscribe here for some spicy industry news, and over there if you fancy something a bit more cheerful. But for now, I'd rather you stayed here and enjoyed hearing more about today's mess, as thus far I've only given you one bite of today's shit sandwich. Now, this is where we need to talk about Netflix's business model, because this is genuinely the linchpin of everything that's happening. Netflix doesn't want you to buy things. Netflix wants you to rent them permanently. They want you to own nothing and be happy. In fact, the entire platform exists on the principle that you never actually own anything ever, because when you subscribe to Netflix, you're not purchasing films or shows, you're borrowing access, and that access can be revoked, modified, censored, or removed entirely at any moment for reasons as pathetic as their corporate risk management committee deciding that it might upset the wrong demographic. That's the direction gaming is being pushed towards. Physical games, permanent digital ownership, the idea that if you pay money for a product, it should remain yours. These concepts are obstacles to the subscription-ridden future that Netflix needs to justify its valuation. Gaming isn't something you're supposed to purchase anymore. It's something you subscribe to indefinitely, not because players demanded it, but because Silicon Valley needs endless streams of revenue to keep shareholders smiling during quarterly reports. And once games are fully absorbed into that subscription model, there is effectively no consumer leverage left. If Netflix owns a game and distributes it exclusively through a subscription platform, you don't have the right to keep it. You don't have the right to archive it, and you absolutely do not have the right to preserve it for future generations. Netflix becomes the gatekeeper of your cultural memory, and if they decide something no longer fits the tone of modern corporate ethics, they can quietly re-edit it, censor it, modify it, or delete it outright without you ever knowing. Imagine Mortal Kombat's fatalities being quietly patched into less problematic alternatives because someone in an HR meeting thought decapitation was a little too aggressive for Q4 projections. And that's what's really crazy, is that none of this is paranoia. That's simply how corporate culture depressingly functions now. Of course, there's also the ideological micromanagement to consider, which is the part nobody from the lamestream media wants to talk about because it's messy, controversial, and risks triggering the exact online mobs studios are terrified of in the first place. Netflix has a long history of inserting cultural narratives into its projects, sometimes successfully, sometimes painfully, and occasionally in ways that make audiences wonder if the script was written by a marketing department rather than a writer's room. The execution often feels strangely performative, as if someone has ticked a box marked represents modern values, rather than actually exploring those themes in any artistic sincerity. And gaming, bless its heart, has already suffered enormously from similar ideological meddling. We've watched developers change long-established character designs because social media found too many curves offensive. We've watched marketing campaigns apologise for mechanics nobody had complained about yet. We've watched concept art get redesigned according to imaginary grievances. Modern developers live in constant fear of a Twitter pile-on. Studio heads live in fear of activist journalists. And the entire industry seems paralysed by the possibility that saying the wrong sentence might result in a week-long internet meltdown. Netflix taking control of Warner Bros. Games all but guarantees that ideological risk management becomes central to every project. And because Netflix operates according to the emotional temperature of social media, it isn't even the players they're trying to please. It's an online perception, it's PR optics, it's the vague sense that every decision must pass through a corporate moral filter before being allowed to exist. Creative freedom doesn't collapse with a dramatic outburst, it quietly suffocates under softly worded consultancy emails, internal memos about brand safety, and a dozen diversity review committees staffed by people who have never touched a controller in their lives. Now, Warner Bros. Games were already spiralling before Netflix got involved. This isn't a glamorous adoption of a healthy creative institution. It's more like someone reluctantly inheriting a problem child and hoping positive thinking will fix it. They were already pushing studios into exhausting live service models, already cancelling promising projects mid-development, already transforming beloved series into endless content ecosystems designed to keep engagement metrics ticking rather than deliver actual artistic value. Netflix isn't inheriting a thriving creative organisation, it's inheriting a decaying corporate structure being sold off because the parent company couldn't figure out how to stop breaking everything it touched. The whole situation is beyond miserable. Meanwhile, as this bullshit has been happening, regulators in the United States and Europe have already begun making polite noises about whether this level of consolidation is healthy. Some Republicans have openly expressed concern about Netflix's cultural influence, and various EU regulators have quietly raised eyebrows at the sheer scale of what Netflix now controls. But the reality is that the regulators are always years behind the technological reality. They're responding to problems that already happened last decade, not the ones unfolding now. By the time the complaints are filed and the committees form and the investigations begin, the consolidation will have reshaped the landscape and everyone will pretend it was inevitable. Once gaming consolidation reaches this level, reversing it becomes practically impossible, because there's simply nowhere else for these games to go. And while all of this is happening in boardrooms and government documents that none of us will ever see, gamers themselves are slowly being conditioned to accept less ownership, less freedom, less creativity, less physical media, fewer daring ideas, fewer experimental projects, fewer eccentric developers willing to take risks, and far more corporate policies dictating what games are allowed to look like. Physical games will become nostalgic curiosities, something collectors show their grandchildren like museum exhibits. Digital ownership will become as rare as a functioning Assassin's Creed launch. Creative freedom will dissolve into HR-approved templates, entire franchises will be transformed into subscription funnels, forever dangling upgrades and timed access like carrots on a digital stick. Eventually, your ability to play a game will exist only for as long as Netflix decides that the game is still brand appropriate. And that, ultimately, is the depressing truth. Gaming is being reshaped into a streaming ecosystem because corporations see more money in locking people into monthly dependency cycles. You won't own anything, you won't control anything, and you won't even know what's been changed in the background because some executive in acquisitions decided the original art direction didn't align with the current cultural mood. Netflix owning Mortal Kombat doesn't necessarily mean that you'll never upcut someone into a pit again, but it does mean that every uppercut will need to survive a committee meeting about inclusivity optics, global sensitivities, and the potential community impact of cartoon violence. At that point, even the fatalities won't feel fatal. They'll feel like a health and safety demonstration wearing a Mortal Kombat costume. So I'd genuinely love to know what you think. Not just as a viewer or a gamer, but as someone living through a moment where the shape of our hobby is being rewritten behind closed doors. So let me know what you think in the comment section, because the truth is that none of us really know what this future looks like yet. But the warning signs are all blinking at once and nobody in power seems remotely bothered. Still, if you're tired of all of this awful news, don't forget that you can use my instant gaming links to get your hands on some of the best games for next to nothing. And if you're really sick of modernity, then why not go check out my Lady Arcades channel, where each week I have been looking at all of the craziest consoles of yesteryear. Alternatively, if you really like what I do and want to access my behind the scenes cosplay library and more by becoming a backer over on Patreon, I'll see you all again very soon.